assist the officers. If we're able to get through this mostly by earlier in the afternoon, and that's certainly what I'm aiming for, then we will call it a day at that time. We'll have a break, and I would like us to come back on Monday. I want the officers to just make sure that they've got all their I's dotted, T's crossed, so that we can come in and finalise the deal on Monday morning. All right, so on the basis of that, we are at G on page 73. We will accept the apology of Councillor Wayne for lateness.
Putting in his nomination.
Yes, I'm sure there will be a rush, but I will not be joining it. So we'll move that. It's
Listen to the herald.
seconded by Councillor Callum Penrose. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against passed. Right, so councillors, just as I said, some great speeches, good matters debated yesterday. I think most everyone pretty much cleared out their various views on the unitary plan, its strengths and its weaknesses, which is good. I don't want to take a lot of repetition today. Very keen to keep focused and really move forward with some good pace. So, Penny or John.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good morning. Good morning, councillors. So, G is the dwelling threshold issue that we've talked about before. This is the trigger in the mixed housing suburban and mixed housing urban zones, which do comprise on the maps roughly 60 or more % of the residential parts of Auckland. So the question is whether the trigger for requiring an urban design assessment should be 3 or more dwellings or 5 or more dwellings. The council's case at the hearings was 3 or more dwellings. That was agreed with a wide range of submitters during extensive workshops and mediation prior to the hearings, including parties on all sides of the spectrum from a growth intensification point of view. So it was a little bit of a surprise that the panel has recommended lifting the threshold to 5 before you need a resource consent. So our recommendation is to stick with the council's case, reject the panel's recommendation, and have the trigger for an urban design assessment being 3 or more dwellings in the mixed housing suburban and mixed housing urban zones.
I'm happy to move, Mr. Mayor.
Right, is there a seconder? Yeah. Right, I'll take Councillor John because we want to get you into a bit more moving and secting. So that's good. Any debate? I'll move it. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against passed. Move on to H. Minimum sizes.
Yeah, H is the issue of a minimum dwelling size standard, very similar to the one we discussed yesterday in relation to the city centre and the business zones. Our controls that we put to the panel were slightly different in the residential zones, but by and large still requiring a minimum dwelling size. The panel again has recommended that that is removed from the unitary plan, as they feel the Building Act and the Building Code are a more appropriate place to deal with this issue. Unfortunately, on the agenda, page 75, the reasons at the top there why staff do not support are missing, but they are actually in the recommendations themselves on page 79. Under C on page 79, those are the reasons, and they're up on the screen. That's probably the best way to look at them.
Oh, right.
So,
Yep, very good.
I don't think there's too much.
Right, is there a mover? Councillor Chris, seconder please. Councillor Bill. Right, move that. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against passed.
No.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, sorry, rather Dick. We'll record that. On to page 70.
Okay, so moving into some technical matters here. Technical matters in the residential zones, page 75. Again, just some things that we feel as officers it's important to correct or make some changes that make the plan more workable or more sensible. So this one is just we have talked about this previously. The panel has recommended deleting the front boundary fence rule. That would result, in our view, in fences being permitted up to 2.5 metres in height. That's higher than most of the district plans have provided for in the past.
By the most houses.
So we are recommending a rejection of that recommendation and the introduction of a fence rule. back into the unitary plan for the residential zones listed on the screen at the moment: single house, mixed housing, suburban, urban, and the terrace and apartment building zone.
I want you to just fire through these and then I'll come back to pick up any concerns that might be raised.
J is what we call the alternative height in relation to boundary control. That's the control that governs how close really the second and third and fourth stories of any residential buildings could be to their neighbours. The alternative height in relation to boundary control is more lenient than the standard one. The standard one is up 2.5 metres vertical on the boundary and 45 degrees. The alternative one is more generous, as I've said. The panel has allowed applicants to choose one or the other without any additional assessment from council. The council's case was that if you're going for the more lenient control with a taller building closer to your neighbour, that should go through a resource consent process to look at the impacts of that additional bulk, and the panel has, it may be an error, we're not entirely sure, but we think the cleanest way to deal with it is to reject allowing for the alternative, more lenient control as of right, and it should be assessed as a restricted discretionary activity as per the council's case.
Councillors, just as we're listening to Chris's very interesting answer call on her phone, can you just put it on vibrate for all you? Just quickly grab your phones and just put it on vibrate. Quiet. Thank you. Right, carry on.
Okay. Again, sticking with height in relation to boundary controls on the residential areas, the panel has introduced a height in relation to boundary control for, relative to the front boundary. Now, these controls are really designed to minimise the impacts of second and third stories on neighbouring sites, not so much the street. From an urban design point of view, having a second story, or in the more intensive residential zones, a third or a fourth story relatively close to the street is not really an issue. In fact, many urban designers would say it's a positive outcome to have that sort of surveillance and overlooking of the street. So we're not quite sure why the panel has introduced this control in relation to the front boundaries or street boundaries. So the recommendation is to reject the introduction of height to boundary and the alternative height to boundary relative to streets, because we don't think there's any strong urban design or amenity justification for having that control.
Right.
L is a technical issue around a standard in the residential zones relating to reticulated water supply and wastewater network capacity. The panel's amendments have moved that control into assessment criteria, so it's not a strict standard, it's assessment criteria. Watercare are comfortable with that. What we're not comfortable with is the panel has introduced a reference to on-site wastewater treatment, which may be an error because in these residential zones that the control applies, in almost all cases there is reticulated wastewater. So Watercare are concerned that a provision here starts to imply that having on-site septic tanks in urban areas is absolutely the right thing to do, whereas from a Watercare perspective that would have to be looked at very carefully. So it looks like it's just an error in the drafting, and so the rejection is in relation to a criteria that deals with on-site wastewater in urban reticulated areas, which seems to have popped in error. M is the definition of building coverage. Building coverage is a fairly tried and tested controls in the district plans and in the unitary plan around what percentage of your property you can cover with buildings, and the panel has deleted the definition. We feel that it does need a definition, particularly as you'll see in the report. We had excluded eaves, building eaves, from the definition of coverage, because there is some evidence in the past that people have pulled the eaves back in or not even had eaves in order to comply with that coverage control. So some of the operative district plans did this as well. They excluded building eaves from the definition of the building footprint coverage. So inadvertently, we think this has caused a bit of a problem, and we think we should have a definition of building coverage. So we reject the panel's recommendations to delete the building coverage definition. And that's it.
Right. Sir John, would you like to move these? Yep, good. And do we have a seconder? Yeah.
Oh, these are pretty.
No. Councillor Bill. Right, now, why don't we just go through, we'll start from,
Mr Mayor, I've just got a general question.
yep, I'm just going to deal with those. This is a general question relating to
Well,
all of these matters?
No, it's weaving through a number of them, which is the height,
Okay, there you go, we'll do that first.
the height of the front fences, because it appears that we're kind of almost giving up on our previous position on front fences. Can we work us through that? Because if you connect that with what we were talking about garages on the front yesterday, it's like you're going to end up with a lot of mini gated communities. The streetscape will be potentially just, I mean, you have the potential to have a whole street with a garage at the front and fences that are 2 metres or whatever, which looks pretty bleak, potentially very dangerous for cars exiting, certainly if it was a driveway rather than a garage, and you cannot see through. It just, street amenity seems to have been compromised with our position. Can we have an explanation of that?
It is a difficult one. Many of the operative plans have allowed fences up to 2 metres in height for many years. In many cases, people don't take that opportunity, and they have, I guess, pride in the streetscape and are quite comfortable doing an attractive lower fence or wall or hedging. But yes, in some parts of Auckland, particularly on very busy arterial roads, is where you start to see those larger fences up to 2 metres in height. And often people are doing it because their only outdoor living space is in the front.
Yeah.
And they're on a busy road, and so it's a balance between enabling people to give themselves some privacy and amenity in perhaps their only outdoor living area at the front, which does occur, and on busy roads it is a particularly tricky situation, balancing that with trying to achieve the best streetscape outcomes possible. So we did have a position in the hearings of only allowing fences of, from memory, about 1.5 metres.
Was, yeah.
And then if you wanted to go above that, it had to have that open, transparent look for surveillance. The panel has come back with a recommendation to delete the control entirely. We are recommending a middle ground. The other alternative will be to reject the panel's position and go back to the council's position on fences.
So why, I can understand the compromise, but why can we not compromise with 2 metres with having, 0.3 of a metre or 0.5 of a metre, so that you can actually see through whatever is there?
Well, if that's the view of the committee, then that's quite possible. Sorry, the governing body.
Yeah, Councillor Chris.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we need to make it very clear that this is a compromise position. This is not the council original position. And I recall us going through this with some detail. So we've got a section 32 sitting in behind the former position. I would like to move an amendment that we defer to the previous position. It was a very well crafted position, and it does not exclude a fence higher than 1.8. You can go higher. There's just you just go through the process. So, Mr. Chair, I would like to move that we adopt the council position going into the hearing and reject the IHP's recommendations here. And again, this is about the quality of the public space and the private space, but particularly the public space. And we are the people, we are the guardians of that public space. And there are streets that are deserving of a higher fence, and maybe if members are concerned about that, they could modify our recommendations or our motions to allow for 2 metres on arterial roads, or a hierarchy of roads which do need that extra screening or may need that extra screening. But I stress, let's be the guardians of the public domain. There are just too many communities which have become totally gated, and when you get those 2 metre, 2.5 metre high fences, you get security risks. And I lived in a community in St Mary's Bay where the fences went up and up and up, and the burglaries went up because it was a great place for burglars to hide on the inside of a fence.